Hello everyone, my name is Ruzbe. This talk is about deep learning generalization and the convex out of training sets. So generalization is an open research problem for deep learning, especially for image classification. And it also relates to other subfields of research about deep learning. From one point of view, these models are highly overparameterized. As a result, there are infinite minimizers for their training loss, but only a subset of those minimizers would lead to a model that can generalize well. If we succeed in choosing the good minimizer of training loss, the model would classify the images correctly, but still it would be vulnerable to adversarial examples, and its interpretation would also not be clear. So most of these issues come down to some basic questions, like what does a model actually learn from images and how does it generalize? After we have trained a model, we can think of it as a classification function that basically maps images to classes. And a classification function basically partitions its domain and assigns a class to each of those partitions. The partitions are defined by decision boundaries, but for deep learning models, these decision boundaries are geometrically complex in the high-dimensional space of the domain. Here in this talk, I'm going to focus on the convex hull of training sets. So for standard image classification datasets, we see that most of the testing samples fall outside the convex hull of training sets. So the models have to extrapolate to some degree. So let's focus on, let's see how significant that extrapolation is. On the top row here, we see some images from MNIST, from testing set of MNIST that are farthest from that convex hull. And below the line, you see what it takes for one of those images to reach the convex hull of training set. We can see the changes for the convex hull of all classes, and we can see what it takes for that image to reach the convex hull of each specific class. So we see that these changes are significant. For the CIFAR10 dataset, left column you see original images, and in the middle column you see what has to be removed from that image in order for it to reach the convex hull of training set. And on the right, you see the resulting image. So these changes in the middle column are significant, and they also relate to specific features about the object of interest. So the extrapolation is not a lot, but it is significant. So now that we know a neural network has to extrapolate in order to classify the testing data, let's consider a simple example and see how we can actually learn outside the convex hull of training sets. So for this data set, labeled as red and blue, we can fit a polynomial that would perfectly separate them. And let's be mindful that the domain is bounded here, the gray box around. This is also true for image classification datasets because the pixel space is bounded. And then let's see how this generalizes outside the convex hull. And that's the answer. But can we be hopeful that this would work well for the unseen data? For the unseen data inside the convex hull of the training set, we can be hopeful that this could perhaps generalize well if the testing data has basically the same label distribution. But outside the convex hull, we don't know. So let's assume that from some prior knowledge, we know there's a unique decision boundary that would generalize well, both inside and outside the convex hull. And this is that decision boundary. And then let's think about how we can reshape the previous decision boundary in order to obtain this one. And the answer is basically we have to overparameterize it. Because the polynomial of degree 7, which we showed in the previous slide, would not be able to have this shape. And we can show that this necessity for overparameterization using the orthogonal system of Legendre polynomials. But then let's consider that we have an overparameterized polynomial and we have this training set, but how can we minimize our training loss in order to obtain this specific decision boundary? So for the original case, if we have a polynomial of degree 7 and the training set, we can just minimize the training loss to 0 and we would obtain that polynomial. But in the overparameterized regime, there would be these different decision boundaries that would all have the same shape inside the convex hull, but they would have different shapes outside the convex hull. And in order to pick this specific decision boundary, this specific polynomial, we have to use a specific training regime. So this signifies the importance of training regime in tandem with the overparameterization. So the same data set, let's consider how a neural network can learn that simple data set. When we have 2 neurons or 10 neurons, the neural network wouldn't be able to perfectly fit the training set, and there would be, and it could, as we increase the number of neurons, also the variation of the output of the network outside the convex hull changes. When we increase the number of neurons to 20, the model would be able to learn the training set perfectly well, but also based on the training regime we use, it can have very different shapes outside the convex hull training data. Same with 40 neurons, again, it fits the training data perfectly well. It can have very different shapes outside the convex hull based on the training regime. So in conclusion, we showed that overparameterization and the training regime work in tandem to shape the extensions of decision boundaries, and deep learning models have to extrapolate in a significant way in order to generalize well. Thank you.